9:10. Is everybody good out there?
Good afternoon, folks. The Vice President and I have some good news to report. And I'd like to make two key announcements today related to our COVID-19 vaccination effort. As you know, a few days ago, after a rigorous open and objective scientific review process, the Food and Drug Administration issued an emergency use authorization for the Johnson & Johnson COVID-19 vaccine. We should all be encouraged by this news of a third safe and highly effective COVID-19 vaccine. The more people who get vaccinated, the faster we're going to overcome this virus and get back to our loved ones, get our economy back on track, and start to move back to normal. But that's one of my first goals in office when I got in office, was to say that there will be 100 million vaccination shots administered in my first 100 days in office. We've got halfway to that goal in 37 days, and I feel confident we'll make it all the way. As I've said, we have a long way to go, but as I said from the outset, we're going to use every resource of the federal government to make it happen. Among the things I learned when I came in office was that Johnson & Johnson was behind in manufacturing and production. While we had the potential of another highly effective vaccine to accompany the two existing vaccines, it simply wasn't coming fast enough. So my team has been hard at work to accelerate that effort. As I've always said, this is a wartime effort, and every action has been on the table, including putting together breakthrough approaches. And today, we're announcing a major step forward. Two of the largest healthcare and pharmaceutical companies in the world that are usually competitors are working together on the vaccine. Johnson & Johnson and Merck will work together to expand the production of Johnson & Johnson's vaccine. This is the type of collaboration between companies we saw in World War II. We also invoked the Defense Production Act to equip 2 Merck facilities to the standards necessary to safely manufacture the J&J vaccine. And with the urging and assistance of my administration, Johnson & Johnson is also taking additional new actions to safely accelerate vaccine production. Johnson & Johnson's vaccine manufacturing facilities will now begin to operate 24/7. In addition, we'll continue to use the Defense Production Act to expedite critical materials in vaccine production, such as equipment, machinery, and supplies. I've also asked the Department of Defense to provide daily logistical support to strengthen Johnson & Johnson's efforts. And I want to thank Johnson & Johnson and Merck for stepping up and being good corporate citizens during this national crisis. Here's what all this means. We're now on track to have enough vaccine supply for every adult in America by the end of May. Let me say that again. When we came into office, the prior administration had contracted for not nearly enough vaccine to cover adults in America. We rectified that. About 3 weeks ago, we were able to say that we'll have enough vaccine supply for adults by the end of July. And I'm pleased to announce today, as a consequence of the stepped-up process that I've ordered and just outlined, this country will have enough vaccine supply, I'll say it again, for every adult in America by the end of May. by the end of May. That's progress, important progress. But it's not enough to have the vaccine supply. We need vaccinators, people to put the shots in people's arms, millions of Americans' arms. To date, we brought back retired doctors and nurses. We deployed more than 1,500 federal medical personnel you usually see during national disasters from the Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, and the Commissioned Health Corps at the Department of Health and Human Services and the Defense Department, including the National Guard, with thousands more to come. We're also increasing the places where people can get vaccinated. We've sent millions of vaccines to over 7,000 pharmacies to make it easier for folks to get their COVID-19 vaccine shot like they would their flu shot. The federal government is also working with states to set up hundreds of mass vaccination centers in places like stadiums, community centers, parking lots that vaccinate thousands of people per day. My wife Jill and I just visited one in Houston last week. It's incredible. And with this increased production of 3 safe and effective vaccines, we have an opportunity to help address the urgent national need more quickly and getting our schools back open safely. Right now, an entire generation of young people is on the brink of being set back a year or more in their learning. You can ask millions of parents, they understand. We're already seeing rising mental health concerns due in part to isolation. Educational disparities that have always existed grow wider each day that our schools remain closed and remote learning isn't the same for every student, as you all know. Our educators are doing everything they can to protect and educate our students despite the lack of resources and as districts face budget crises that risk education jobs. Moms and dads are exiting the workforce in astonishing numbers in order to care for and manage the school experience for their children at home, hindering their own opportunities and further undermining the health of our economy. This is a national imperative that we get our kids back into the classroom safely and as soon as possible. As you know, back in December, I set a goal for having a majority of our K-8 schools open by the end of my first 100 days as president. To achieve that goal, I sent the American Rescue Plan to Congress to provide vital help to make sure schools can reopen safely. Essential things like more teachers to reduce class sizes, more buses and bus drivers to transport our kids safely, and more space to conduct in-person instructions and more protective equipment, school cleaning services, physical alterations that reduce the risk of the spread of the virus, all cost money. The House passed the American Rescue Plan last week, and I hope the Senate will follow as quickly and as well. You know, also the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, the CDC, issued new guidelines on how to reopen our schools safely. It's a roadmap that will enable schools, if they have the resources they deserve, to reopen safely. I have given those schools a roadmap. I've asked Congress to give them the tools, and today to add one more tool to school reopening, a vaccinated workforce. Let me be clear. We can reopen schools if the right steps are taken, even before employees are vaccinated. But time and again, we've heard from educators and parents that have anxieties about that. So as yet another move to help accelerate the safe reopening of our schools, let's treat in-person learning like an essential service that it is. And that means getting essential workers who provide that service, educators, school staff, child care workers, get them vaccinated immediately. They're essential workers. Over 30 states have already taken the step to prioritize educators for vaccination. And today, I'm using the full authority of the federal government. I'm directing every state to do the same. My challenge to all states, territories, and the District of Columbia is this. We want every educator, school staff member, child care worker to receive at least one shot by the end of the month of March. To help make this happen, starting next week and for the month of March, We'll be using our federal pharmacy program to prioritize the vaccination of pre-K through 12 educators and staff and childcare workers. Throughout March, they will be able to sign up for an appointment at a pharmacy near them. Now, I want to be very clear. Not every educator will be able to get their appointment in the first week, but our goal is to do everything we can to help every educator receive a shot this month, the month of March. I want to conclude with this. We're making progress from the mess we inherited. We're moving in the right direction. And today's announcements are a huge step in our effort to beat this pandemic. But I have to be honest with you. This fight is far from over. I told you I'd be straight up with you from the beginning. As I said many times, things may get worse again as new variants spread and as we face setbacks like recent winter storms in the Midwest and South. But our administration will never take this public health threat lightly. Though we celebrate the news of a third vaccine, I urge all Americans, please keep washing your hands, stay socially distanced, wear masks, keep wearing them, get vaccinated when it's your turn. Now's not the time to let up. I've asked the country to wear masks for my first 100 days in office. Now's not the time to let our guard down. People's lives are at stake. We have already, and I carry this in my pocket, lost more, as of today, we've lost more than 511,839 Americans as of today. It's got to stop. We need the United States Senate to follow the House and pass the American Rescue Plan, because despite the optimism, without new resources, our entire effort will be set back. We need the resources of the American Rescue Plan, and we need it urgently. We need them expanding testing, ramp up vaccine distribution, fund FEMA and other federal vaccine efforts, and continue reimbursing states for their efforts. We need the resources to expand genomic sequencing to stay ahead of emerging variants, find the protective gear, transportation, staffing, and other costs required for school and business to open safely. We need to fund it. The bottom line is we need the American Rescue Plan now. Now. There is light at the end of the tunnel, but we cannot let our guard down now or assure that victory is inevitable. We can't assume that. We must remain vigilant, act fast and aggressively, and look out for one another. That's how we're going to get ahead of this virus, get our economy going again, and get back to our loved ones. So thank you, and please, it's not over yet. Great news, but stay vigilant. May God bless you and may God protect our troops. Thank you all very, very much.
Mr. President, why is only 1% going to vaccines, sir? Why is only 1% going to vaccines, sir?
When do I think things are get back to normal? I've been cautioned not to give an answer to that because we don't know for sure. But my hope is by this time next year, we're going to be back to normal before that, my hope. But again, it depends upon people continue to be smart and understand that we still can have significant losses. There's a lot we have to do. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Did you receive a briefing about the border today?
Yes, I did.
What did you learn?
Is there a crisis at the border, sir?
devoted to fulfilling a wish list of longtime liberal priorities, including billion-dollar bailouts, progressive program expansions, and pricey partisan pet projects. And let's talk about a few of those. Look at this right here. A New York bridge to Canada. That's $1.5 million for a bridge connecting the state of New York to, yes, another country, Canada. Or what about this one? The cleverly worded provision that earmarks, yes, I said it, folks, earmarking is already happening right here, $140 million to a subway in Silicon Valley in California. What does that have to do with COVID? And a whopping $350 billion blue state bailout that rewards the states that have imposed the strictest lockdowns. Folks, we should be rewarding the states that demonstrated leadership by finding ways to safely stay open, not those that shut down our schools, closed our businesses, and killed our American jobs. But most importantly, COVID relief should stay focused on COVID. There's still about $1 trillion of COVID funding that Congress previously approved that hasn't even been spent yet. Yes, folks, $1 trillion. So why in the world are we looking at spending yet another $2 trillion, of course, on things that are not even related to COVID? That isn't to say that there aren't needs, because there are. We know that all across our country. But instead of bridges and bailouts, the money should be focused on immediate help to get our moms and dads back to work. And to do that, we need to do a few things. One, let's safely reopen our schools. Let's, number two, expand access to quality, affordable childcare. And number three, distribute the vaccine as quickly as possible. And while the bill does actually provide some assistance for these purposes, even here, the Democrats show how out of touch they are with what's actually happening on the ground. For example, nearly $15 billion is included for the Child Care and Development Block Grant. You would think that's a good thing because it's needed. But at a time when so many moms are being forced to choose between their careers and children as a result of school closures, the support is needed. But a loophole in the bill that is coming over from the House allows millionaires to use up this program, which was created to make quality childcare affordable for working parents who are struggling to make ends meet. Yes, millionaires qualify for this assistance, not just our struggling families. And while additional funding will certainly help many, expanding eligibility to those millionaires who have the financial means to afford their own nannies will not. Well, the bill also extends the enhanced unemployment opportunity, the unemployment benefit, and it does provide an extra $400 per week for those who are out of work because of the pandemic. There, again, another loophole. There is no limit placed on the eligibility. That means someone who may be out of work but is still earning $1 million or more qualifies for these bonus payments. Now you might laugh and ask, how many people would apply for unemployment assistance if they were making $1 million? Well, folks, the answer is thousands. During the Great Recession just a decade ago, more than 3,000 individuals with adjusted gross incomes of $1 million collected unemployment benefits. Because this bill doesn't cap who may receive support, jobless millionaires may end up collecting as much as $1 million in enhanced unemployment assistance every week. This is like a reverse millionaire's tax. The Democrats are paying millionaires not to work, with taxes paid by lower income workers. How do you like that socialist scheme? So if you're a coastal elite living in California or New York and maybe making $1 million despite being out of work, this bill is especially generous for you. But folks, this isn't monopoly money. This is the real deal. And someone has to eventually pick up the tab. Sadly, it is going to be paid out of the pockets of essential workers and others who are continuing to work, those that pay taxes and keep America running. Now, as an eternal optimist, I am hopeful that when this bill comes before the Senate, my Democrat colleagues will actually work with us to cut the pork and refocus the bill on what it should be focused on: the immediate needs of the COVID pandemic. Not a fancy subway, not a bridge to Canada, and certainly not wealthy state bailouts. Focus on the immediate needs of the COVID pandemic. And if not, I'm afraid the Democrats will just keep passing go and collecting hundreds of dollars from hard-working taxpayers across this country, only to pay for their pricey, partisan pet projects and wish list items that have nothing to do with COVID. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.
Mr. President, Senator from Indiana,
I don't rise today, Mr. President, in opposition to COVID relief, nor do I rise today to oppose money for vaccine distribution and testing, nor do I rise to oppose stimulus spending for those who really need it, our hard-hit businesses, rank and file fellow Americans. And I certainly don't rise to oppose additional grants and loans for other enterprises out there that just aren't going to be able to make it through this, like our not-for-profits that are essential to all of our communities. But I rise today, instead, Mr. President, to oppose this partisan, pork-filled American Rescue Plan. You know, I'm not known for histrionics in this body, and I'm not engaging in them. This is a partisan bill full of a liberal wish list of items that frankly aren't popular with Hoosiers, and they won't be popular with the American people the more they get to know about what is loaded up in this $1.9 trillion package of goodies. In the last year, during a time of political division and strife, this Congress came together around COVID relief. We rose to the challenge presented to us by this global pandemic. We didn't bring it on. By most accounts, it came from China. But we came together to address this foreign threat that came to our shores, that's decimated our economy, that threatens lives and livelihoods. And we passed 5 relief measures with well more than 90 votes in every instance. The total, nearly $3.5 trillion. And I make no apologies for those investments. Those were investments in public health. Those were investments in our communities. Those were investments in our employers. Those were investments in our loved ones, to provide them safety and security and a measure of comfort, but to save their very lives. These were investments in our frontline workers. We did all that in a bipartisan fashion with very little opposition. Very little opposition. Unity. That's what this country needs. I heard that coming from the lips of Republicans and Democrats alike at the highest levels weeks ago, and that's what I pine for. I want our country to be unified. I believe we can be unified. But this is not a step in the right direction. Even though much of the money that we have allocated to address the many consequences of this global pandemic has not been spent yet, we Republicans have tried to work with the Biden administration on a 6th relief package over the past month. In fact, I was one of 10 Republicans who, I say this commendably towards the Biden administration, and specifically, I commend the president for inviting myself and 9 other Republicans into the Oval Office to discuss our counter-proposal. Now, I have to say, this $600 billion proposal that we were providing was, for this United States Senator, a bit of a stretch. You know, so much money was still in the pipeline, it wasn't even clear that much was needed. But we certainly did not need $1.9 trillion, and we all agreed upon that. Unfortunately, we sort of left that meeting with a supposition that unfortunately has been substantiated, that there was an intention to move forward regardless of the respectful and fact-based exchange we had about the wastefulness of the $1.9 trillion package and the extent to which the $600 billion package more than met the needs of getting people vaccinated, getting people back to work, and getting our kids back to school as safely and quickly as possible. Here we are, though. Instead of a targeted COVID relief package, we've seen our Democratic leaders load up a $1.9 trillion bill with wish list items. And so here's what I'm going to have to educate Hoosiers on in coming months, because I think they actually believe this is mostly about vaccination and getting kids back to school and getting people back to work, and I wish that were the case. But no, it's about borrowing money so that we can pay for, I think, what can fairly be characterized as a blue state bailout to the tune of $350 billion. You see, a lot of states aren't like the state of Indiana. The state of Indiana over the years has balanced our budget and come up with a rainy day fund, and we were criticized oftentimes for not spending money out of that rainy day fund, but the rainiest of days hit, and Indiana was ready. Not every state did that. Many states have elected leaders that have made unfulfillable promises to their constituency over the years related to their retirements and so forth. And so now in this package is $350 billion going towards those states to be used for purposes other than the pandemic relief. Also in this bill, $1.9 trillion package is a Silicon Valley subway. I'm not sure how it got in there. I do know that Speaker Pelosi hails from the area. The National Endowment for the Arts, the National Endowment for the Humanities. I love arts. I love the humanities. We can debate the proper role of government in funding these public cultural goods, but let's do it some other time. Let's not do it in the course of pandemic relief legislation. Expansion of the Paycheck Protection Program to provide loans to Planned Parenthood, forcing certain taxpayers like myself to violate our conscience. Much, much more. It's full of waste. It's fat with waste. This body passed a $1.9 trillion CARES Act in March of 2020. 1 year later, Democrats along party lines are poised to jam through another $1.9 trillion package. Now, to give you some sense of how much $1 trillion is, these numbers can be abstract sometimes, but try to visualize $1 bills stacked from the ground halfway up to the moon. That's $1 trillion, I was told earlier today. That's a lot of money. And we're borrowing every cent of it. I think it's important we consider the difference between what we passed a year ago and what we are now considering is likely to pass along party line votes. When the CARES Act went into effect, the nation was shut down. Only so-called essential businesses, businesses that could operate safely, were open. Indiana's unemployment rate then was 17.5%. We've done a great job managing this crisis in the state of Indiana. Most businesses are reopened. The unemployment rate is 4.3% in our state. We don't have the same public health challenges of other places who've shut everything down. I'll let others try and divine why that is. When the CARES Act became law, not a single school in Indiana was open. In Indiana today, most schools are open to in-person learning, in-person instruction, many full-time. And let me take this opportunity to commend our administrators and our teachers in the state of Indiana for showing up for work. We don't see that all around the country. Last week, in more than 2,000 schools in Indiana, there were only 62 teacher cases. I told you, basically all the schools have opened up, only 62 teacher cases in Indiana. That's one case for every 33 schools. I'd say we're doing a pretty good job managing the risk, following the science. When the CARES Act became law, a vaccine was a far off dream. And I can remember President Trump indicating there'd be a vaccine by year's end. People laughed. Democrats scoffed, mocked. Members of the media mocked him. Not only do we have one vaccine, but then comes vaccine number 2 and vaccine number 3, all in the pipeline because of Operation Warp Speed that the Trump administration implemented to at once streamline the regulatory process for approval and also begin manufacturing in parallel. It's good that the Biden administration is building on those successes. So look, there is no doubt that some Hoosiers and many Americans are still hurting. We can and we will and we must help those people. But President Biden and the National Democrats' so-called American Rescue Plan is not the way to do it. This just is not responsible. We're better than that. So we who oppose this, we who happen to be Republican United States senators who oppose this partisan effort to use this crisis to advance initiatives like arts funding and a subway next to Speaker Pelosi's district along partisan lines, we're not going to just let this pass and allow the National Democrats to cram unrelated policies into what should be a bill squarely targeted at this crisis. We need a bill just like the 5 bills that we passed in a strongly bipartisan fashion just last year. So today we have more than 1 million Hoosiers who have received their first dose of vaccine, including more than 70% of Hoosiers age 70 and older. There's no doubt that some Hoosiers are still hurting. Again, we'll be helping those folks. So this is really quite simple, Mr. President. We need to work together, Republicans and Democrats, for the good of the country. This does indeed remain a national crisis. We had negative economic growth last year because a global pandemic interrupted the greatest period of economic growth in my lifetime. We need to recover. We're poised for recovery this year. But we need to do it in a targeted, in a fiscally responsible way, and in a fashion that doesn't undermine trust among one another, and one that doesn't break trust with the American people by spending their money irresponsibly. I regret that probably won't happen in the next few days, but I resolve to continue fighting for Hoosiers, for fiscal responsibility, and to constructively work with this administration however we can moving forward. With that, Mr. President, I yield the floor.
President.
The senator from Oklahoma.
Mr. President, last week we paused as a Congress to recognize 500,000 people that have died in the United States due to COVID. Unfortunately, that number is still climbing. 500,000. It's a lot of families that are affected, that are a lot of lives lost. That's a lot of pain that we have experienced as a nation. And obviously, that's a global pain that is being experienced. Over the last now 11 months, this Congress has gathered in a bipartisan way 5 times with wide bipartisan majorities to be able to address the issue of COVID-19. We've allocated $4 trillion, all of it borrowed, all of it. None of this was budgeted money. All of that borrowed money with a common agreement that this is a pandemic and a crisis, and to be able to stabilize the American economy, we have to do what we have to do, but we should not do more than we have to, knowing that every dollar we're spending is borrowed. Last year, at almost this exact same date, this Congress gathered together and put together a $2 trillion CARES Act package. It was an aggressive package because we saw the shutdown of the American economy. Quite frankly, we saw the shutdown of the world's economy at that time period. Literally, the world seemed to stop by the end of March, and we all went into seclusion. We saw dramatic spikes in unemployment and desperate need around the country, but we all knew this was a crisis moment, and we will get through it, and we'll get out of it. Now, at almost a year later, where we saw unemployment soaring to 15% plus across the country, we're now at 6.7% unemployment. Every state is open at some stages, and some states completely open. Many schools are open. Some schools continue to stay closed and say they're afraid, and then they're not going to re-engage, while thousands and thousands of other schools around the country are open and taking care of their kids in person. We've seen this patchwork of response, but one thing is very true about right now versus 11 months ago. We're in a very different place now as an economy and as a nation than what we were 11 months ago. But the strange thing is, now 11 months later, my Democratic colleagues are putting forward a $1.9 trillion package, almost the exact same size of what we had getting into the beginning of this. They're doing it as just about everyone sees we're at the end. They want to borrow another $2 trillion. And it's not just a $2 trillion to be able to spend towards COVID. I wish that was so. 1% of this package actually goes towards vaccines. 5% of this package actually goes towards public health. In the school funding portion of it, 95% of the funding in the school funding portion of it, which is $170 billion for school funding, won't even be spent this year at all. At all. Let me run that past you again. 95% of the $170 billion allocated for funding for schools won't be spent in the year of the pandemic at all. It's future spending. And to give you a picture of how big $170 billion is towards education, the total United States education budget for the entire Department of Education this year is $66 billion. For the entire year, for all of education in the whole country, it's $66 billion. And my Democratic colleagues say, but we need to spend $170 billion just for COVID, which, by the way, we're not going to even start spending until next year. Do you know why? Because this bill is not about COVID. I wish it was, because there's real need out there. I wish it was. This is for things like $350 billion to go to cities and states to be able to bail out some of their pension funds and other things that are there. Why do I say that? Because when you look at the statistics of what the revenue loss for the states across the entire United States, the revenue loss for all states is 0.1% from last year. 0.1%, not 1%, 0.1% change. Because almost every state is dependent on property tax. And as people that live with pay property tax know, you're still going to have to pay your property tax. So the revenues, quite frankly, continues to stay strong. In many of the cities that I have in Oklahoma, in fact, one of the cities in my state just last week reported their revenue for sales tax revenue is up 20%. 20% in their revenue. Because people are staying home and shopping more. They're doing more shopping online, and so the tax revenue is actually coming back into their states and their cities even more in many of these communities. But there's $350 billion allocated to these cities, and you would think, well, there'll be some fair distribution. Actually, that would be nice, but it's not true. They set up an unemployment formula that's based on those states that shut down the longest and kept everything closed the longest. They're the ones that actually get the most money. So in other words, if you reopened your economy and you work to get your schools open and you work to get jobs open, you get a chance to have very little support. If you stayed closed and kept your schools closed and kept your businesses closed, well, then you'll get additional dollars coming in, regardless of what your revenue is. Even for big states like California, that their revenue actually went up last year. California, let me run that past you again. California's revenue went up last year. They get $27 billion out of this after their revenue went up. remembering that in the CARES Act last March, this Congress added $150 billion to cities and states, $150 billion, and spread that around the country to be able to cover it. And then because it was a panic to think there's going to be major losses, but at the end of it, 0.1% off of the previous year. This has additional funding for Planned Parenthood, and I'm not sure why abortion is needed for COVID relief, but they have additional money for Planned Parenthood included. They have a tunnel for San Francisco, which clearly is not COVID related, a bridge in New York State, $50 million for climate justice grants. There's on and on and on, all these additional things that are just stuck into the process. And I would say this Congress has been active to be able to do what it takes to be able to help in every moment, but we've also tried to be wise in the process to say, let's spend what needs to be spent when it needs to be spent. Well, let me give you an example of that. As I mentioned for vaccines, in this particular bill, 1% is set aside for vaccines. But that would be interesting, except for the fact in vaccines, the CDC has distributed only $3 billion of the almost $9 billion that Congress has allocated to the CDC for vaccine distribution. They still have almost $6 billion remaining for vaccines right now. They've only spent $20 billion of the $37 billion allocated for the vaccine treatment and development and testing. Only $20 billion of the $37 billion for the actual development treatment, still another $6 billion remaining for distribution. And on top of all of that, today, the Biden administration said they've struck new deals with vaccine folks so they can get vaccines to every single American by the end of May. They already have all that they need for vaccines distribution, development, and purchasing, yet this particular bill asks for billions more in vaccine because that sounds like a good idea. Except when you check the facts, they already have all they need for the vaccine purchase, development, distribution. But it sounds good, kind of like we need more money for education. Sounds good when you say you need more money for education, except for the vast majority of the education funds, like around $86 billion, is still unspent from the previous bills in education money that was sent. For the ag money that's been allocated, $26 billion for ag, just done in December, only $24 billion remains of that $26 billion. In other words, ample funds are still sitting there for ag, for assistance, for schools, for vaccines, for testing. There's $14 billion still remaining in the fund for testing, untapped. But my Democratic colleagues can go to the microphone and say, we need money for schools and for vaccines and for testing. And everyone's like, oh my gosh, certainly we do, until you check the facts and find out this is not about vaccine and testing in schools at all. It's about all the pet programs that go with it, and it's about allocating billions and billions and billions of dollars to agencies so they can hold them and use them for other things. That's what this is about. And it hides under the cloak of COVID. And it hides behind the pain of 500,000 Americans who have lost friends and family members. Don't use their pain to be able to amp up government. Let's have the debate about issues that we need to have on government. But don't abuse the pain of Americans and pretend you're trying to fix something that we're not trying to fix. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
The senator from Wyoming.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to join my friend and colleague from Oklahoma, as well as the senator from Iowa who has previously spoken, the senator from Indiana, in opposing this Democrats' $1.9 trillion spending bill. The Democrats want to call it the sixth coronavirus bill. In fact, that's false. It's not a true statement, because only about $1 out of every $11 being spent on this monstrosity is really focused on coronavirus health. The rest is a partisan liberal wish list that the Democrats have wanted to pass for a long, long time, long before the pandemic, long before anyone in this country had ever even heard of coronavirus. I remember President Obama's chief of staff, Rahm Emanuel, famously said, "Never let a good crisis go to waste." Well, Mr. President, That's what they did under President Obama. They saw a crisis. They passed laws that had nothing to do with what had caused it. And now here we are a dozen years later. President Biden is in the White House, and he is using that playbook once again. President Biden's chief of staff calls this bill, the one coming to the floor right now, he described this on MSNBC the other day as the most progressive domestic legislation in a generation. The most progressive domestic legislation in a generation. More progressive than Obamacare, more progressive than the Obama-Biden stimulus. Doesn't sound like a coronavirus relief bill to me. So the White House chief of staff admits this isn't mainstream. This is radical. And, he's absolutely right about that. In the House, not a single Republican voted for this bill. Actually, Democrats joined every Republican in opposing it. President Biden ran for president as being mainstream, as being a unifier. That's how he got to the Oval Office. But ever since then, it's been scorched earth partisanship every day since that time. Last week, President Biden gave a speech about the bill. He talked about Senate Republicans, those of us who are on the floor today and coming up next. He said, what would they cut? I'm very glad he asked. President Biden could start by cutting $350 billion of bailing out from states and local governments. State tax revenues are down less than, 0.1%? We've just heard from the senator from Oklahoma. Most states actually have more tax revenue than before the pandemic. Actually, 44 states more tax revenue than before the pandemic. President Biden could cut the $85 billion that's earmarked for union pension funds to bail them out. Nothing to do with coronavirus. Unions have been mismanaging their members' money for decades. President Biden could cut the $4.5 billion for the New York City subway system. He could cut $111 million for a subway system in Silicon Valley for Nancy Pelosi. $270 million in funding for the arts and the humanities. He could cut $200 million for museums and libraries. That's not coronavirus. He could cut $12 billion in foreign aid. Could cut $36 billion in subsidized health insurance for people making over $100,000 a year. It's a lot of income to additionally get health insurance subsidies. We all know President Biden loves Amtrak. Well, he could cut $1.5 billion in funding for Amtrak in this bill. Nothing to do with coronavirus. He cut $1.5 million for the funding for the bridge from New York to Canada. Probably a pet project of the majority leader. To answer the president's question of what could we could cut a lot. Thankfully, the Senate parliamentarian already cut $67 billion from the bill. That's how much Democrats' national wage mandate was going to cost. Yet there's still a lot we can cut. Here's the bottom line. The people of Wyoming, who I visit with every weekend when I'm at home, they don't want to live a wish list. They want to make sure they can stay at work, that their kids can stay in school, and they get the virus behind them. And I say stay, that's because the kids in Wyoming have been in school since last August, in spite of the fact that it seems like only about half of the kids in America are back in school. You can either get to yes or you can get to no, and the people of Wyoming wanted to get to yes when it came to getting kids back to school. What we see President Biden doing is saying yes to the teachers' unions. He's paid the ransom note. And this is the money being paid to them. Not to get our kids to school, but to keep the teachers' unions happy. I believe teachers want to get kids back to school. Teachers want to teach, but not the unions who pull the strings and are certainly pulling the strings of Joe Biden in the White House. Working families don't want politicians to exploit a crisis for political gains. They want to protect their physical health and their financial health and well-being. So it's time to stop trying to exploit a crisis, which is what I see every Democrat doing. Let's give the American people what they really need all across the country. getting back to work, getting kids back to school who aren't there already, and putting the disease behind us. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.
Senator from Iowa.
Before I speak, I ask unanimous consent that myself, Senator Braun, and Senator Hirono be able to complete our remarks before the vote.
Is there objection? So ordered, without objection.
I want to compliment that the Commodity Futures Trading Commission operates a highly successful whistleblower program. As one of the senators who led the effort to establish that whistleblower program back in 2010, I'm proud of what this program has accomplished. Since the commission issued its first whistleblower award in 2014, whistleblowers have helped the agency root out waste,
Feel that cool air. It's very nice in here. Hope you have your sweaters ready. Good afternoon. A few things at the top. Yesterday, the department submitted to Congress and publicly released the International Narcotics Control Strategy Report, or INCSR. The INCSR is the Department of State's annual country-by-country report that describes the efforts of governments to address all aspects of illicit global drug trade and associated money laundering. The illicit drug trade remains one of the most pernicious threats to U.S. public health and security, as well as to international stability. The United States has a critical national interest in keeping dangerous illegal drugs from reaching our citizens, and the INCSR highlights the importance of working with the source and transit countries to reduce supplies of these drugs. Continuing global efforts to reduce drug demand remains the most effective and cost-efficient means to achieve this goal. Over the past year, the COVID-19 pandemic had a significant impact on drug control and drug treatment efforts around the world. The pandemic contributed to the lethal effects of drug use and also hampered counter-drug efforts as governments diverted resources to other public health needs. Law enforcement responders were among the hardest hit, with lives tragically lost due to the virus. The United States recognizes that political will is the most important determinant of success in a global fight to achieve a reduction in drug production, and we will remain committed to working with like-minded governments to reduce illicit drug flows and drug use. Moving over to Yemen now. Based on the recent complex Ansarallah attacks, including those on Saudi Arabia this past weekend and even again last night, the United States is imposing sanctions on two senior Ansarallah militant leaders, Mansour al-Saadi and Ahmed Ali Hassan al-Hamzi. These are in addition to the three Ansarallah leaders that remained sanctioned when the group's designation were revoked last month. As the Secretary has said, we will continue to closely monitor the activities of Ansarallah and its leaders, and we are actively identifying additional measures to promote accountability for the perpetuation of violence in Yemen. And finally, on Russia. Today, the Department of State joined Treasury and Commerce in a coordinated whole-of-government action against Russian government entities and Russian officials for attempting to assassinate opposition figure Alexei Navalny with a chemical weapon in Russia in August of 2020, and for his subsequent arrest and imprisonment. The heinous poisoning of Mr. Navalny preceded his arrest and imprisonment on politically motivated grounds. It is clear that Russian officials targeted Mr. Navalny for his activism and his efforts to reveal uncomfortable truths about Russian officials' corruption and to give voice to Russian citizens' legitimate grievances with their government and its policies. We are exercising our authorities to send a clear signal that Russia's use of chemical weapons and human rights abuses have severe consequences. Any use of chemical weapons anywhere, at any time, by anyone, under any circumstance, is unacceptable and it contravenes international norms. We also welcome the action taken by the EU earlier today to impose costs on Russia under its own new global human rights authorities. These actions today demonstrate that there will be accountability for the use of chemical weapons and actions that violate international norms and abuse human rights. The United States calls upon Russia to comply with its obligations under the Chemical Weapons Convention and to declare and destroy its chemical weapons program under international verification. We reiterate our call for the Russian government to immediately and to unconditionally release Mr. Navalny. With that, Matt, happy to turn over to you.
Right. Thanks. Before I get to questions, I just wanted to make a very brief kind of opening little thing. And it is just to say that it has not gone unnoticed by the people who cover this building, the people in this room, people in Washington, whether they're Republicans or Democrats, people out around the world, that you have gotten up here every day, 4 days a week at least, and one day on the phone to, try to explain or defend, if needed, administration policy. And I just want to make the point that it's appreciated, whether you're successful in what your goal is or not. It is it's a welcome change, and I just want to make that clear.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, everyone. We'll see you tomorrow.
For the record. Right now, on to the question. So why is this administration's foreign policy so far an abject and epic colossal failure? No, that's not my question. Mike, I know that people want to talk about Russia, but I want to just start with Yemen. So I've been after you on this very subject of Yemen and the leaders of the Houthi leadership for more than 2 weeks now. And you continue to say that you left the 3 Nasrallah leaders on the sanctions list, but yet you removed them from the terrorism sanctions list. So now that you and you said that you tried to make that same point again today by saying that you had left them on the other list, but doesn't the designation of these 2 additional people today suggest that you're at least having second thoughts, or you think that it may have been a mistake to remove the 3 other ones from the terrorism list in the first place, because the situation has gotten worse, not better? And so if it was intended as an overture to try to get them to moderate their behavior, it hasn't worked.
Matt, I would take the 2 additional designations today as a sign that we will continue to hold Houthi leaders, Ansarallah leaders, to account for their reprehensible conduct, including their continued attacks against Saudi Arabia. I've said this previously. You referenced this. But the 3 Houthi leaders you referenced have been, and they still are, subject to U.S. and UN sanctions. Any property they have subject to U.S. jurisdiction is blocked. That was the case before. It remains the case now. U.S. persons cannot do business with them. That was the case before. That remains the case now. The practical implications for the 3 Houthi leaders you mentioned, the 3, not including the 2 we added today, but today with the 2, now 5, the implications for them are similar, whether they're designated under our authorities related to Yemen, which we used in the case today of these additional 2, or our authorities related to terrorism. I think the point is that we are not focused on a label. We are focused on taking steps to end the conflict in Yemen through a political track. And importantly, this gets back to the revocation of the broad designation to alleviate the suffering of the people of Yemen, to alleviate the humanitarian suffering that has afflicted this country for so many years now. I've cited the stat before, but it's so important. 80% of Yemen's civilian population lives under Houthi control. When Ansarallah was subject to a broad designation, it was the 80% of Yemen's people that suffered as a result. We want and we will continue to hold Ansarallah's leadership to account. We did that today with 2 additional leaders, Ansarallah leaders, who are now subject to sanctions under our Yemen authorities. We, at the same time, do not and will not do anything that adds to the humanitarian suffering of the Yemeni people. We can do 2 things at once. We can hold Ansarallah's leaders to account while not adding to the humanitarian suffering of the people of Yemen.
So is there a metric by which you can demonstrate that the removal of the Houthis broadly from the FTO list and for the 3 leaders from the terrorism list, not from the other list, but is there a metric by which you can show to us, that demonstrate to us that the humanitarian situation in Yemen has improved since the administration's decision?
Well, Matt,
Or has it in fact gotten worse, which is what a lot of people think, including the UN?
I'm not confident, and in fact, I'm quite certain we can't measure humanitarian impact over the course of hours or days. It's been just a couple weeks now since that broad designation was lifted. I think we're going to be looking. We're going to be looking at trends. We're going to be looking at trends over time. Obviously, there was an important funding conference yesterday. The United States pledged nearly $200 million. We've encouraged the rest of the world, including our partners in the region, to raise their ambition when it comes to the humanitarian suffering of the Yemeni people. I think the other metric, if you will, that we're looking at is measured in our efforts to promote a political solution to this horrific conflict in Yemen. And we look at that in terms of what Tim Lenderking, the special envoy, is doing in the region. He is now on his 2nd trip there in just a few short weeks of having held that position, working closely with the UN special envoy for Yemen, Martin Griffiths, working closely with governments in the region to try and bring a sustainable, durable end to this conflict in Yemen. Again, that's not something we can measure in hours. It's probably not something we can measure in days, but it is something we are prioritizing at every level to achieve progress on going forward.
Can you measure it in any aspect at all, whether it's gotten better or worse in the 2 weeks that you guys are, 2.5 weeks? Because I get it. Yeah, you appointed someone. He's a good guy. He's an accomplished diplomat. He's now been there twice, but that's just a lot of talk. And a donor conference, well, that's great. But you know what? A bunch of people speaking virtually from air-conditioned rooms in Washington and Berlin and London. It goes back to like the Syria political talks. A bunch of people hanging out in Swiss hotels, yakking away, doesn't affect the situation on the ground necessarily.
Matt,
so what, if anything, can you point to suggest that since you've lifted the FTO designation and the other designations, it has gotten better for the people in Yemen who are suffering so horribly?
Matt, we lifted that broad designation in the first instance so as not to add to the humanitarian suffering of the people of Yemen. I don't disagree with you in one respect. No one is satisfied with where we are in Yemen. No one is satisfied with the status quo. That is precisely why, as one of his first acts in the foreign policy realm, President Biden appointed Tim Lenderking to a position that had not existed before, to a position as special envoy for the conflict in Yemen. That is precisely why Tim Lenderking, in his few weeks on the job, has already been in the region twice. It is precisely why he has met on multiple occasions with the UN special envoy, and why he has continued to meet with regional partners. This progress, we are doing everything we can, and there is a lot we can do. Number one, to reverse some of the measures, including the revocation that we've talked about, that added to the suffering of the Yemeni people, just as we then go about the business of prioritizing a political solution to this conflict. That is what Mr. Lenderking is doing. That is what the president has prioritized. That is what Secretary Blinken has prioritized. And that's something where we will measure progress, not in minutes, not in days, but going forward, it's something where we expect we will be able to find progress
sure
because
Tim-
we're investing in it quite heavily.
I'm sure Tim appreciates all the confidence that you have in him, but his appointment is not like, some grand, big thing. I mean, it's a one guy, and great. I get that he's doing a good job. He's a good diplomat. He knows what he's doing. But the appointment of one guy is not, it's not a game changer. And you seem to be saying that it is. So anyway, I'll stop.
Please.
And on this, on Tim Linderkin, has he met with or spoken with any Houthi representative while in the region? Does he plan to? Is that something we expect to happen soon?
Sorry, is it
Is
something?
that something we should expect to happen soon?
Well, we certainly have ways to get messages to the Houthis if we need to. There is no doubt in their minds about where the United States stands when it comes to their conduct, when it comes to our expectations of Houthi leadership. They saw that again today with the two designations we announced. Tim Linderkin, he is traveling throughout the region again. This is his second trip. He's met with the UN Special Envoy. He's met with regional partners there, and he will continue to do so in the conduct of that diplomacy that we think is necessary to help bring about a political solution to this conflict in Yemen. Yes.
Thank you very much. Voice of America Russian Service, and I will join colleague in gratitude. Your work is outstanding.
Thank you. I
Really.
appreciate that.
I have.
I didn't say that.
Let the record show that Matt Lee also said we were outstanding. But before, are you going to ask about Yemen or something else?
No.
Or was that your only statement, which I'm fine with too?
No. My questions, of course, were about Russia.
Russia. Is anyone want to ask about Yemen or related topics? Yes.
Oh, just quickly, what message do you think that the sanctions today sent to Iran? Because I believe Iran was mentioned in some of the documents, and the ties to the Yemen figures, and how does that conflict with Yemen and Saudi Arabia affect what you're trying to do with Iran?
Well, look, what we said today in that statement is that it is undeniable that Iran has fanned the flames of conflict in Yemen. Iran has exacerbated tensions. Iran has added to the already combustible situation that has been ongoing in Yemen for some time, threatening even greater escalation, miscalculation, regional stability. Nasrallah, of course, relies on Iran for weapons, for other forms of support. And so when we have talked about our approach to Iran, we have talked about the proposition that is on the table and has been on the table for quite some time when it comes to Iran's nuclear program. But we've also talked about that as a necessary but not sufficient element, because what the first candidate Biden, now President Biden, has propositioned is this so-called compliance for compliance prospect. The idea that Iran returns to compliance with the JCPOA, the United States would do the same. We would then lengthen and strengthen that nuclear agreement, but then use it, importantly here, as a platform to negotiate follow-on agreements that cover other areas of malign activity. And we've talked about Iran's ballistic missile program, but clearly when it comes to Iran's malign activity, we have to talk about Iran's dangerous adventurism in the region. It is certainly an area that we would seek to address. It's certainly something that we will address going forward, because it does add to the combustible situation that we find ourselves with in Yemen. We'll move to Navalny unless... no, yes, please.
Thank you. We see that Washington joined Europe in sanctioning Russia, but in difference with Europe. European Union sanctioned only people in uniform, like special services, interior ministers, so on. You sanctioned, US leadership sanctioned two guys directly from the Kremlin, from political leadership, Sergei Kiriyenko and Andrei Yarin. Does it mean that Washington believes that political leadership, Kremlin, was in control of Navalny's fate? That it was not like excessive behavior of some, again, people in uniform? It's, yeah. And short second question, it was like pronounced that you did that sanctions were adopted in coordination with Europe. What do you expect in return? Like to be on the same page on Nord Stream 2? Do you have any progress with Europe on Nord Stream 2 at all? Thank you.
So let me take your first question first. Of course, we have worked closely with our European partners on the challenge of Russia since day one of this administration. Secretary Blinken, President Biden have had the opportunity to speak on a bilateral basis with a number of their counterparts in Europe. Secretary Blinken, for his part, has attended virtually, of course, 3 meetings of the E3+1 that included him. He attended a meeting with the Foreign Affairs Council, the EU FAC, last Monday, I believe it was. In just about every one of these engagements, the issue of Russia has come up. The issue of Mr. Navalny has been a constant topic of discussion bilaterally and in multilateral fora between the United States and our European partners. Having said all that, the United States and the EU and the UK, we have different authorities. And so the sanctions that we announced today, the designations that we rolled out today, they certainly complement, even if they may not be entirely identical to what you have seen from the EU and from the UK in recent months. But together, they send an unambiguous signal that the United States is working closely with our closest allies and partners in Europe to make clear that this kind of behavior is not acceptable. We will not countenance it. We will not tolerate it. And there will be penalties going forward. Now, in terms of our sanctions today, we released a 5-page fact sheet from here that go through the various entities that were sanctioned. The Russian Federal Security Service, the FSB, was among those entities, including for the attempted assassination of Mr. Navalny. So I think that speaks to the other element of your question. Remind me of your second question now?
No, my actually question was, do you believe that political leadership is directly involved? Because we know, and European Union decided as well, that Secret Service is involved. Do you think that Kremlin is involved?
Well, today among those entities we sanctioned was the Russian Federal Security Service, the FSB. And so I think that speaks to where we believe culpability lies, but I would need to refer you to the intelligence community for a broader assessment of that specific culpability.
Second question was about, do you expect something from Europe in return to for this cooperation on, let's say, Nord Stream 2?
So I've spoken to our coordination and our correspondence and communication with Europe in a different context. Of course, we have had an opportunity to speak to our European allies and our European partners about the Nord Stream 2 project, specifically our profound concerns with Nord Stream 2. President Biden, even before he assumed this high office, made very clear his position that Nord Stream 2 is a bad deal. It is an example of Russia's aggressive actions in the region, provides a means for Russia to potentially use a critical natural resource for political pressure and malign influence in the region. We will continue to work with our allies and partners, including Germany, Ukraine, other European countries, to counter Russian efforts to undermine our collective security. So we have made very clear to our European partners across the continent where we stand when it comes to Nord Stream 2, and that hasn't changed. Simon?
Staying on Russia, the 7 officials that you've sanctioned today, do you have any reason to believe that they have assets under US jurisdiction? And, you know, whether that's the case or not, what makes you believe that Russia is going to change its behavior because of these, you know, these latest sanctions? The EU had already delivered sanctions in October, and that's even before he was arrested. So, you know, why do you think that this is going to trigger behavior change that hasn't happened already?
Well, we announced these actions today to make clear that with the poisoning, the attempted assassination of Mr. Navalny, with his continued imprisonment that is politically motivated, with the, in some cases, brutal treatment of his supporters who took to the streets to exercise the very rights that are granted to them under Russia's own constitution, that is not something that the United States will abide. It is not something that our European partners and allies will abide. As you mentioned, there were sanctions from both sides of the Atlantic today. Our sanctions were significant. Europe's actions were significant. Taken together, this is a sizable penalty for Russia. It is a sizable penalty to which Russia was not subject prior to today. With these actions, the United States in many ways caught up to where Europe had been, because as you said, Europe announced measures last October. With our measures today, we are bringing our actions very closely in line with what our European partners had already spoken to. So when the United States and Europe act in conjunction with one another, when we both take steps to impose these costs, those costs will be noticed in Moscow. And it will also be noticed that the international community is standing up to underscore a norm that chemical weapons cannot ever be used anytime, any place, and by anyone. That is a clear signal that we sought to send today with our closest allies and partners.
But what about on the issue of assets, though? Do you have?
I would need to refer you to Treasury if there are specific assets. More on Russia? Yes. I'll come right to you.
You mentioned several times from the podium that you want to work with allies and partners to stop Russia from building the pipeline. Of course, Germany is a partner of Russia's in building that pipeline and disagrees with your efforts to stop that pipeline from being built. So the first question is, how do you square your desire to work with allies and partners when the key ally, in this case, Germany, fundamentally disagrees with you on whether that pipeline should go ahead? And second, would the U.S. be prepared to sanction German entities such as Nord Stream 2, the company which is undeniably actually building the pipeline? Thanks.
What we have said, and we have made very clear to partners all across Europe, whether that's Ukraine, whether it's Poland, whether it's others, whether it's Germany, that the United States has profound concerns with this pipeline. It is a bad deal. It is not only in the interest of the United States, it also runs contrary to Europe's own stated energy goals. Now, we have engaged in good faith with our German partners. We continue to discuss this with them to make clear where the United States stands. We announced we submitted a report to Congress just a few days ago with additional action against KVT Rus, an entity which we had identified as taking part in sanctionable activity. We are continuing to evaluate the entities involved in this Nord Stream 2 project. I believe it is that we owe a report to Congress every 90 days. The next report will be due to Congress in May, I believe it is. And so in between now and May, if we have additional information that meets the threshold for enacting sanctions, I expect we will be informing Congress of that.
Just a quick follow-up, would the U.S. be prepared to sanction German entities like Nord Stream 2? I mean, its involvement in this pipeline is, on its face, pretty obvious.
We are prepared to uphold our legal and policy commitments. I wouldn't want to get ahead of that.
Yes, sir.
Sorry, I promised I'd come back to you. Yes. Yes.
This is a question for a coworker who are not able to be here on Russia. So there are 8 names that were not sanctioned today by the U.S., but who were requested by Navalny's team in January. Is there a reason why?
Well, U.S. sanctions, we have a certain threshold. We have certain requirements that we must meet in order to sanction a particular individual or entity. So in the first instance, we have to satisfy our own criteria when it comes to enacting sanctions. We took a close look at the available information, the available evidence, drawing on public sources, drawing on sources that are unique to the United States government. And the target set that we sanction today, those are the targets that are consistent with our obligations under the various laws and executive orders to enact sanctions.
Thank you. Can I ask?
Would you say that that information that you use to do that is equivalent or roughly the same as the same intelligence information that linked Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman to the murder of Jamal Khashoggi?
I wouldn't want to characterize an intelligence assessment from here. Yes.
Just following on those two questions and the question about the deterrence effect of today's sanctions, is it
Mr. Kane, aye. Mr. Peters, aye. Ms. Lummis, aye. Ms. Markowski, aye. Ms. Rosen, aye. Mr. Van Hollen, aye. Mr. Merkley, aye. Mr. Kelly, aye. Mr. Kennedy, aye. Mr. Sass, aye. Mr. Rounds, aye. Mrs. Fisher, aye. Mr. Kramer, aye. Mr. Hickenlooper, aye. Mrs. Hyde-Smith, Mrs. Hyde-Smith, aye. Mr. Tillis, aye. Mr. Johnson, aye. Mr. Lee, aye. Mr. Casey, aye. Mr. Moran, aye. Ms. Duckworth, aye. Mr. Young, aye. Mr. Daines, aye. Mrs. Feinstein, aye. Ms. Smith, aye. Mr. Schumer, aye. Mr. Paul, no. Mr. Shelby, aye. Mr. Durbin, aye. Mr. Scott of Florida, no. Mr. Sanders, aye. Mr. King, aye. Ms. Klobuchar, aye. Mr. Blumenthal, aye. Ms. Cortez Masto, Ms. Cortez Masto, aye. Mr. Murphy, aye. Mr. Romney, aye. Mr. Bennett, aye. Ms. Cinema, aye. Mr. Hawley, aye. Mr. Menendez, aye. Mr. Burr, aye. Mr. McConnell, aye. Ms. Hassan, aye. Ms. Baldwin, aye. Mr. Ossoff, aye. Ms. Ernst, aye. Mr. Coons, aye. Mr. Brown, aye. Mr. Inhofe, aye. Mr. Warner, Mr. Warner, aye. Mr. Haggerty, aye. Mr. Bozeman, aye. Mr. Cruz, aye. Mr. Sullivan, aye. Mr. Portman, aye. Stabenow, Ms. Stabenow, aye.